I'm Dan.
And I'm Alex, and welcome back to On Air. We hope you are having a very pleasant Wednesday or Thursday or Friday, whenever you are listening to us on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. Dan, before we get going, let me check in with you. How are things?
I'm good. I am in a kind of unexpected place today, I think. I am in Bulgaria, enjoying life, skiing, which I haven't done outdoors in 12 years. So I feel good. How are you?
It's been a while. It's been a while. And Bulgaria is quite, I mean, it's not the kind of classic European option of the Swiss Alps and the French Alps and so on, but it is. I am hearing more of it year on year, I would say, of people going to Bulgaria to ski. How have you been finding it?
Well, your kind love to come here because I feel like 2 out of 3 people are Brits on the slope, which is shocking. And it led me to look into some stuff because I was like, where are all these people coming from? I knew Ryanair flies a lot from the UK to Sofia, but also Jet2 every Saturday shuffles in like 1,000 people from all over the UK, Nottingham, Liverpool, Bristol, into Sofia to go skiing. So it's always fun to investigate because sometimes you're curious why there's a certain demographic, and the explanation is in aviation. The explanation is on Flight Radar 24. So,
yeah, well, aviation is the enabler, not just the enhancer, but the enabler. Yeah. Well, that's good. I'm glad you are having a good time, and
do you ski?
Stay safe as well. What did you ask? Sorry.
Do you ski?
Yes. Actually, I think skiing was the first ever trip we went on when we were babies, and there's photos of us in a rubber dinghy on the slopes, being, trailing along behind mum and dad. So definitely, we've always been skiers.
I asked, do you ski, not do you go in a rubber dinghy behind someone on the slope?
And I set the context in that, yes, obviously, because it was the first ever trip. Yes, though, we do ski. But there are very specific... There are specific ski resort / areas that I like. Firstly, I like skiing in good weather. And what I mean is the skiing with the blue sky, and that's the skiing in a blizzard in a cold January day where it's grey and white and you can't see anything. I take absolute zero enjoyment from, so then I would prefer to ski later in the season than now.
Yeah, and that is why you come to Bulgaria, because we're like a 4-hour drive from Greece. So you can imagine the weather is so much better here. We've had sunshine every single day, beautiful views of surrounding mountains, and amazing olives because we're so close to Greece. So every hotel breakfast has tapenade, olives, all these amazing Mediterranean type of foods, which I appreciate as well.
You see, my people, the Greeks, ensuring you start your day off right with some decent olives and
I know they know how to do
the right breakfast. They know we know what's good. We know what's good. Well, look, I'm glad you're enjoying. Continue to enjoy. Send me photos. I mean, guys, people would think that I have a podcast with the guy, right? So maybe we're in touch. Maybe he shares his plans. Maybe we discuss. Nothing. I learn when you learn. The guy's too busy to even respond to me between episodes. It's
my God! Let's stop this narrative now.
Yes, let's stop. You're right.
Before we get into the main topic, only topic of today, we haven't mentioned yet because we're so into our season 1 grind that we're not doing video today. Obviously, if you're watching us on YouTube at this point, you realize that. But because of where we are, there's no video. There will be video again next week. So don't worry. Yeah.
Okay, good clause. And that is because both of us are very much on the move. We're always on the move, but this week we just couldn't make it. So we're like, you know what? The priority is the episode. We go audio only for a week, and we'll see you guys, as usual, all being well, next week in Vision, where you can join us on YouTube, as many of you are, and we're appreciative for that. Good reminder, Dan. Well, in today's episode, we wanted to take a paced, sensible, broad, kind of deeper look as to what happened in the US over the last 6 days with the awful tragedy, the American Airlines accident, the mid-air collision with a Black Hawk military helicopter at DCA, Ronald Reagan Airport. That's the equivalent. That's like the city airport in Washington, D.C. I think although there have been a few kind of examples here and there over recent weeks, sadly, with Jeju Air in Korea, and then of course with Azerbaijan and what happened there with Russia, and a few other smaller things that got media attention because of those two major ones. And then now this, the complete unexpected, perhaps one of the most shocking aviation accidents in modern history, taking place in no other area than actually the US Capitol, a stone's throw away from the White House, a few days into Trump's presidency. You could not make this up. It was an absolutely awful scenario that is going to have long-term ramifications for civil aviation, not just in the US, but I think everywhere. And that's why it deserves our full attention on this episode. Dan, let's take people through kind of what happened, and then what are the multiple ramifications as to this follow-up period, and then something a little more long-term.
Yeah. So let's just cover the incident first. I'm sure you all know about it. There will be so much to say when we cover what happened. But just to go quickly through it, we're talking about an American Airlines flight from Wichita, Kansas to Washington, D.C. Reagan National Airport, which is one of the most sort of densely urban populated airports in the United States, if not the world, in the middle of Washington, D.C., so close, as you said, to the White House, the U.S. National Monument, the Pentagon, all these essential U.S. buildings, and it's an incredibly busy airport. So this was an American Airlines flight, a small regional jet, CRJ 700, which is, of course, very common all over the world. And as it was landing into Reagan Airport, at between 300 and 200 feet from the side, a U.S. military helicopter crashed into it, and both aircraft tragically end up crashing into the Potomac River below, and everyone on board has passed away. So we're talking 3 fatalities on board the military helicopter, 69 on the American Airlines jet. So a tragic and seemingly very preventable accident that leaves so many questions for investigators. But of course, what has got so many people talking besides the horrible accident is that the political response and reaction on both sides of the spectrum has just been wild, which is a lot of what we'll be going into now.
And we'll come to that. But sticking with firstly and initially with the accident itself, there is a whole load now footage online showing the different angles as to what happened. But there is no question at the moment about the actual state of play with the commercial aircraft. So the American Airlines flight was making a very routine final approach to the airport in this very densely populated area in the middle of, as Dan described, the Washington Monument, the Pentagon, the White House. It's right there in the middle. If you haven't flown to DCA before, but you can imagine in your head, for example, London City Airport and the way that is nestled on the other side of Canary Wharf and the only real skyscrapers that London has in the financial district area there. It's very close to the O2 Arena. It's close to densely populated urban areas of housing on the other side of the runway. I guess it's kind of the equivalent over in DC, and the airport is frequented by politicians and senators and congressmen and women and so on. It's right there in the beating heart of the capital of the US. Dan, just describe
No, go ahead.
I was going to ask you if you can just describe as the American voice, what is it like arriving at DCA?
So just first, for some context, I like your comparison with London City. Think of London City, but with 6 times more flights. This week, London City Airport has 450 scheduled movements. DCA has almost 3,000. So we're talking an incredibly busy airport. They have multiple runways, 3 runways compared to 1 at London City, but all the runways are intersecting. They're short. They're on this tiny little, basically, island surrounded by some of the most important places in the entire United States. So when you approach, you notice that you're coming in low. It feels you're flying right over some buildings on final approach, sort of not unlike London, although it's not skyscrapers. But when you take off, you usually get the most iconic view where you see basically the most scenic tour of Washington, D.C. possible. But because of that, because you're flying so close to the White House, the procedures for landing and taking off here are not like other airports. There's always noise abatement measures at airports, but here we're not supposed to be flying over places like the US Capitol, like the White House. So aircraft have to take quite unusual routes in order to avoid those spots, in addition to avoiding all the military activity on the ground and in the air that's required to keep the US government safe.
And that's it, isn't it? It is the fact that this is one of the most secure airspace areas in the world, because we are literally talking about the skies above the president's home, the White House, and the Pentagon, and all these other top US federal organizations that are housing, everything from Secret Service staff to state secrets and so on. And so this airspace we're not talking about the usual. We're talking about something quite extraordinary. And yet in all that, not only do you have all of the commercial traffic, but you have military traffic, and specifically you have military helicopters that are escorting personnel. It is the go-to option for anyone that is of a high profile requirement in order to shuttle them from A to B. So not just obviously the president and the Secretary of State, but there are so many different members of the US political world that are entitled or are instructed or prefer to move from A to B by helicopter rather than by road, because it's so densely populated, and the traffic, and also because of security, right? And because of the convoys and the motorcades and the whatever. So you do get quite a lot of military traffic. Specifically, you get these helicopter flights. On this night, we know that it was a training flight. There were 3 in the helicopter, in the Black Hawk. And this training flight, if you look at the course, it was heading directly for the approach path, basically to cross the final approach path of runway 33. Now, there has been a lot of talk as to, understandably so, what on earth was a helicopter doing crossing an approach path of a commercial aircraft with 70 odd passengers and crew on board? Surely it shouldn't have been there. Interestingly, it was just following a planned route. It was following the route. It's Route 4. And this is, if you pull up the maps of the helicopter routes in this area of DC, it's a route that they have been flying for years. And it does cross the approach path of runway 33, putting it on a direct intersection with commercial airline traffic. And so that's the first kind of bit that was the shocking part, I think, to convey. And this happened, so in the Middle East, this happened very early hours, around 3 a.m., 4 a.m. Actually, I think it was a bit later, 4 or 5 a.m. Late at night on the East Coast in the US. And I was up and then across everything and all these awful developments. And I started the morning broadcasting with the UK's Good Morning Britain on ITV. And much of the focus, Dan, in that first part of the discussion I was having with the 2 anchors were, how could a helicopter be there? Surely it was in the wrong place. What on earth was a helicopter doing in this final approach path, so close to the White House, so close to the Pentagon, but crucially so close to commercial airline traffic? Well, theory number 1, very quick to debunk. Actually, it was following a route called Route 4. And how on earth could that have ever existed in a visual flight rule scenario where the helicopter is expected to see all of the traffic? What did you think when you saw this?
It makes you question a lot of the choices that they've made around that airport, right? Because as you say, it seems to make no sense, especially the altitude, where there's a chance that the altitude of an aircraft and a helicopter will match. There is no reason. I mean, I am not a military expert, but I don't see why shouldn't the helicopter, if it had to take that route, at least fly at an altitude where it wouldn't be nearly at a risk of hitting a landing aircraft. And I think the thing that makes this even more complicated is that it's quite common in DCA for aircraft to all approach toward runway 1, which is the main sort of runway down the center of the airport. And then they have these 2 additional runways that intersect with that main runway. So in this case, what had happened, right, is that the aircraft was approaching runway 1, but air traffic control in the last couple of minutes before their landing asked them to switch to runway 33, which it's just a small sort of turn to the right, and then you readjust and align with the runways. So there's just a lot of potential for a last minute decision like that by air traffic control to throw something so delicate off when you already have all these routes in play. So even that is kind of a wild thing, that air traffic control can have all aircraft destined for one runway and then decide to send them somewhere else in an airspace that is so hectic.
And of course, there have been so many questions. So while we're on the specifics of how this accident had taken place, there were many questions I received by DM asking whether or not either the aircraft or the helicopter would have had a collision avoidance system that would have, played a sound, rang a bell, informed either flight deck crew of the presence of nearby traffic. And the quick answer to that is yes, at least for the commercial aircraft. The commercial aircraft, the CRJ, does have TCAS, which is the Traffic Alert and Collision Avoidance System. That's essentially a safety tool that is vital to help pilots avoid awful scenarios like this, and it issues the guidance in real time. So for example, if they are continuing an approach and the aircraft realizes that there is a nearby aircraft, or there is about to be an aircraft nearby, it will issue the correct guidance very quickly, not just warning them that there's an aircraft nearby, but it will say, for example, pull up, meaning that it's already calculated the correct thing to do is to gain height. Perhaps the nearby traffic is beneath. Or it will say descend. And this is very, very rare. This thankfully doesn't have to happen. But it is a system that is there. Now, do we know whether or not TCAS had sounded or worked in this way on the American jet? No, we're still waiting for all of the data to be analysed from the black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. But what I found interesting was, in the day after this announcement, I spoke to a couple of pilots just to gain a better understanding, specifically in the role of the helicopter, as to whether or not TCAS could have sounded. And they're explaining to me that on some aircraft, like the CRJ, at such a low altitude, often the TCAS would almost become diluted for the sheer amount of times it would go to sound if it operated as it does above 1,000 feet. He described it as this. You know the Ring doorbell, right? That gives you a motion alert when someone is near to setting off your camera. In the middle of the day, where you have dog walkers, bin men, and activity, maybe you don't even glance at it because it's not so helpful, because you know that there's activity. But it is really helpful at 2 o'clock in the morning where there is no other activity and you get that motion alert. He described the same for this, in that under 1,000 feet, there would be so many alerts, it would just be impossible to be able to adequately hear air traffic control instructions, to be able to concentrate on what's going on in the flight deck and your checklist, hear comms correctly and so on. So at such a low altitude, between, as you said, 200 and 300 feet, he was saying that he would be surprised if that would have been able to play any role at all, notwithstanding the fact that actually it is an aircraft equipped with TCAS. So that's just something in the Q&A part that I wanted to address from now.
Good point. And also, from what I've read, at that point, pilots usually will just turn it off because it's useless. There's airports where you start flying over the airfield at 500 or 300 feet because you need to get so far in to get to the runways. So if you had all these alerts sounding, it wouldn't make any sense, and it definitely wouldn't be helpful. But even so, as you say, it's interesting to think that potentially the pilots did see something coming or have some indication at the last second, because the latest reporting is that the American Airlines pilots lifted the nose of the aircraft in the second before impact, as if they were attempting to go around or rise.
Awful to know that they were probably just for a split second aware of, you know, of what potentially was about to happen. The other bit I wanted to discuss was this, the setup in that the helicopter and the communication between those flying the helicopter and air traffic control was a confirmation communication whereby air traffic control said, you need to just go behind that CRJ. So basically, can you see that CRJ? To which the helicopter had said yes. Now, analysing this without the benefit of the black box data and so on, it's a little, you know, so they had seen it? No. Perhaps they had eyes on another aircraft. Was it down to that runway switch? Right? Were they looking in another direction? This is a flight operating under visual flight rules. It means that they literally have to see. There is another part of the investigation that is being that the investigators are taking a closer look at, as to whether or not the flight crew on the helicopter were wearing night vision goggles, which apparently in many circumstances can make things worse rather than better in terms of their visibility. And the whole thing around visibility has also played such a big role in this discussion, with even the US president himself, Donald Trump, angrily shouting in his tweets and his posts about how could this have happened, quote, on such a clear night. That part, you know, was kind of shocking as well, wasn't it? Like, we're not talking about a night with weather or poor visibility. It was crystal clear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so many questions left to be answered about this. And I think, as you say, just based on what we know so far, it seems likely that when they indicated that they had the aircraft in sight from the helicopter, because of the runway change and because of the confusion with that, if they're looking straight ahead, they'll see an aircraft that's approaching runway 1. And of course, at night, you just see a bright light. It's hard to tell a distance. So yeah, it's understandable that they might suspect, okay, that's the aircraft they're referring to, and not look to the left to realize, okay, there's another one much closer there. But of course, with a crew of 3 on board the helicopter, it is mind-blowing how they didn't seem to notice.
Right. And then I guess the next part of this conversation can really shift to, okay, what are we looking at when we're looking at air traffic control in the US? And I've spent most of my broadcast time across different networks speaking about this, because if you ask me to speak about the state of play with air traffic control in France, I would mention strikes. If you ask me to speak about ATC in the UK, I would speak about NATs and the multiple IT failures they've had over recent years that have caused, you know, billion-dollar outages for airlines and so on. If you ask me to speak about the state of play of air traffic control in the United States, I would have always described it, over recent years at least, as part of the sector that is absolutely in decay, suffering from chronic staff shortages, suffering from the impacts of the pandemic, having never fully recovered, suffering from lack of staff, lack of manpower, lack of talent, lack of hiring. Hiring has not kept pace. You know, I would have just described all of that. Now, it seems that description, which is still valid today, could have played a role in whatever went down at this awful tragedy at DCA. What do you think about the air traffic control? Not just the role, because we don't know what happened, but what do you think about, as I said, the state of US ATC?
I think you said it very well. And it's horrible, but I don't know what your first reaction was when you saw the accident, but my first reaction was not surprise. When I saw the Azerbaijan Airlines incident, when I saw the Jeju Air incident, both of them, I was like, how did this happen? This is so unexpected. But here, we've been reading for years about close miss after close miss in the US.
We've discussed it on the podcast, have we not? About near misses.
Yeah.
We need to go back and find what episode that's in, and about how it's just an accident waiting to happen. The US has never had so many near misses ever.
Yep, exactly. So it really was never a question of if, it was always a question of when, because just in 2024 and 2023, there were so many instances where we were seconds from disaster with two 737s or A320s colliding. And so many times these traffic warning systems on board have actually come to the rescue. We think about these are systems that we shouldn't have to use, where an aircraft suddenly says, traffic, pull up, or whatever it is. Those are for the most extreme emergencies. So the fact that dozens of times just last year in the US, these systems were relevant is unacceptable. And it goes to show that, as you say, there are huge problems with air traffic control there. So seeing an incident like this, unfortunately, it's kind of, if it didn't happen on this flight, it was going to happen eventually. And something like this, hopefully this is all it takes to be a wake-up call and fix the US system for good.
What an awful scenario to have to play out to get the US to take this seriously. But isn't that the case with across so many sectors, in so many examples of life, where people are asking me why were there so many near misses? Why was that not enough? And it's always not enough because they say, but nothing happened. Right. Yeah. So there's no change because nothing happened. Nothing changes until something does happen. And that's the awful part of all of this. And because there have been no major US aircraft accidents in well over a decade, and there have just been a nice, an awful steady rising near miss rate, then that somehow equates to, we put that in the category of that's, nothing happened, and therefore, life moves on. Just last summer alone, there were 46 near miss incidents in 1 month. We are talking about more than one per day. Now, I'm not talking about amateurs logging these on flight radar and seeing and assessing that that's a near miss. I'm talking about official near misses logged with the Federal Aviation Administration, 46 in a single month, and these incidents continuing to occur at an alarming rate. So then the question, of course, switches to why? What is so wrong with air traffic control across the United States that has led to this dire picture and this awful outcome that almost certainly could have been prevented? There's no easy answer, but there are some quick points as to what has contributed, what has happened here. So the FAA, that's the Federal Aviation Administration, it's a federal body, right? So this is a purely government body in the US, not having decisions made by states or whatever. It's federal. The FAA has struggled for years now to maintain adequate staffing levels across not just their air traffic control towers at many airports, but so many different air traffic control related facilities. And we're not talking about the small town airports where one guy is substituting for two, or one woman is doing the job for her pal who's been off sick for a few months. We're talking about major hubs like New York, like Miami, Washington, that are coping on, for example, 60% of their pre-pandemic level in terms of necessary adequate staffing, and are just making it work. And the experienced older air traffic controllers that were there prior to the pandemic and are now no longer there, that is only something that has continued as the pandemic drew on and into 2021 and kind of into 22, didn't it? And basically hiring has not kept pace. And it also takes years to get an applicant into the tower as a fully fledged, licensed, trained air traffic control professional. We're not talking about, Americans don't want to do it, or it's not attractive anymore, or it doesn't pay very well. I mean, it doesn't pay that well, considering the sheer amount of pressure that they have. But it takes years to get these people to the standard to be able to get them to operate and be responsible for so many lives. How do they fix this, Dan? I mean, what do they do?
Well, where do we start? I think that everyone seems to have different opinions on how to fix this at the moment, which is a big part of the problem. And just last week, we spoke about how Boeing, with the 777X and all their other things, what will their next aircraft type be? The biggest problem for Boeing has come down to it's just about maximizing cost efficiency, maximizing revenue. Yes, the FAA is a government agency, but the US is also, the whole culture is just about maximizing profit or minimizing spend on staff and that kind of thing. So, in my view, again, this is an investment and budget issue that the US is always unwilling to spend, even on things that are extremely necessary to spend on. So,
Yeah.
at what point
this has
do you
long
want to
been
get
the
into
case,
what,
right? This is yeah. I mean, so we will go into that now. This has long been the case, right? This is nothing new. So the lack of spending, the lack of taking it seriously extends basically to the previous 4 administrations, right? So we're talking Obama, Trump, Biden, and now Trump again, and even pre-Obama. Okay, well, Obama was in there for 8, wasn't he? So we're going back quite a while. And again, it's that assertion that, because nothing has happened, then things must be going fine. I guess this takes us into the absolute weirdness of what happened the day after this tragedy. This was a tragedy for the United States. It was a tragedy for the loved ones of those on board, and also just an awful, shocking aviation accident, the worst in well over a decade for the United States. And yet the US president, despite all the protocols that are in place for a fair and thorough investigation led by an independent body that is non-partisan, not political, so the NTSB, for a process that is annexed, clearly outlined by ICAO in order to, for states to follow as to how these incidents, these accidents are investigated, the processes that are put into place. Everyone is very well trained and across these processes, how aviation then learns from it in order to continue to keep it the safest form of transport that it continues to be. And yet the US president, days into his presidency, hosts a press conference for about an hour where I sat there with my jaw in the open position for well over, a good hour, just watching the US president chip away at any kind of normalcy in terms of what happens after something awful like this, and instead rambling that he has the answer as to what happened. He knows what's happened. He knows why it's happened. And when questioned, Mr. President, how do you know any of this? It's hours after. He's talking and loved ones are being pulled from the river, from wreckage. And he's saying, you know why I know this? Quote, because I've got a lot of common sense and most people don't. He says, Trump, the air accident investigator now, as well as the, tweeter in chief and president and everything else. His main assertion was that air traffic control hires have recently been based on diversity, and that air traffic control, and specifically the FAA for air traffic controllers, would go out of their way, he claims, to reject, for example, a straight white guy trying to be an air traffic controller, and would specifically request that only disabled minorities apply and therefore would be successful so that they can make them air traffic controllers. And Trump immediately claiming that is what has happened. He says that DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion provisions are why the US is in this mess, and that the reason so many dozens and dozens of family have now lost loved ones is because the FAA has only been looking for a very, very, very specific demographic to make air traffic controllers. I don't care, respectfully, if this pisses anyone off as a listener, but we deal with facts here on the podcast, right? And what Trump said is a complete load of BS.
Yes.
Air traffic controllers, okay, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, has no bearing on the air traffic control hiring process. We are talking about a 3 to 4 year process, but only the tiniest portion of applicants are actually successful in making it through. Not because the FAA is sifting through based on, checking out your origin, your skin color, your background, and so on, but because it's hard, right? We're talking about one of the hardest jobs ever.
Mm-hmm.
And employing and hiring for ATC has always been governed by such a strict aviation standard with rigorous mental and physical testing that for Trump the next day to claim, oh, it's because of DEI, this is what they're throwing about now for everything, as to why all these loved ones are now without their family members, I thought was sick.
Yeah, I agree. Very well said. And I think the underlying message from Trump here is that a DEI hire is not as qualified or as talented as a non-DEI hire, which, again, as you said, the training required to become an air traffic controller, the test scores required, the results required are exactly the same for every single person who goes through that process. So whether it's a white straight man or a black or a disabled Latina woman, the requirements that they will have to meet are exactly the same. And in fact, I we could go on and on about the war on DEI, but the problem is not having unqualified staff. The problem is not having enough staff. And,
exactly.
It's like just as with pilots and the pilot shortage around the world, that's not being caused by DEI. In fact, I would argue that DEI is helping create more pilots, create a bigger market of people who would consider the job of a pilot who wouldn't necessarily be able to afford it or get into that industry otherwise. And that's
crucially, it doesn't give them the in, does it? They still go through the same process as everyone else.
Yes. So what DEI has aimed to do now I'm talking about pilots specifically, it just aims to increase the potential market of pilots, because what we need is more pilots. There's not enough. So whatever DEI initiatives that FAA has had, it has nothing to do with quality, nothing to do with not hiring a certain type of person. It literally comes down to them not having enough people to hire. So broadening your horizons and looking at other potential people who you might want to sell the job to and say, hey, have you thought about becoming an air traffic controller? You might really enjoy this. You might not have grown up in a family or community where this was even a considered career path, but perhaps this could be for you, and perhaps you could meet the test requirements to help us fill these jobs that we so desperately need to fill. That is what this is about. So to turn it around and say that is the problem is just so twisted. And can you imagine if your child was on that plane crash and the man in charge of the country where this has happened, where we've had countless near misses, comes out and immediately makes it a political talking point instead of sticking to facts and instead of trying to unite people for once. It would just make things so much worse. And then there's the whole other side of the argument, which I'm sure you've seen, which is also misguided from the left, blaming Trump for what happened. Do you know what people have been arguing there?
What is it that they are claiming? I mean, I've seen that the whole thing has been made political.
Yeah.
And it's absurd, but specifically, what are they claiming?
So these are all facts that Trump, during his first few days in office, fired the head of the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration. He fired the entire Aviation Security Advisory Committee. He froze hiring of all new air traffic controllers, and he fired over 100 top FAA security officers. So, Trump on the one hand goes, extreme right and blaming it on DEI. The left goes and blames it on this. Neither of these things are to blame. You can
Correct.
believe what you want to believe about each side, but the fact that anything that Trump did in his first few days in office would have an impact on this, as we've said, we've seen near misses for years. So that
Exactly.
has
We've
nothing
seen
to do with
we've
it
had
either.
categorically we have had the most number of near misses in US aviation history entirely under the Biden administration, right? So it would be just preposterous to now claim that this is all happening because we're days into Trump's presidency. Although Trump has taken decisions that affect US aviation, those decisions that you just outlined, as you said, have absolutely nothing to do with what happened. It's impossible. We're far too early in his second term of the presidency for anything to really take effect. If we were speaking about, how Trump 3.5 years ago, let's say he'd been in power for 4 years, and 3.5 years prior, he had frozen recruitment of air traffic controllers. 3.5 years later, you would have a very valid point to stand on there in order to justify some kind of, it being a contributor. But with this, again, it's ridiculous to have made that political as well. None of this is political. This is why you have so many processes. This is why aviation is categorically the safest form of transport, on par with getting into an elevator, because it's not subject to such political interference. And my concern in the days after broadcasting about this that I was sharing was that all of this rhetoric, all of these inflammatory comments, all of these, statements and claims, these wild loads of nonsense put out across the US political spectrum, risk undermining the investigation itself of this scenario, but also risk the safety of US air travel going forward, because everyone's trying to get a political win, and it's just, aviation is not in that game. Let's be clear. Safety doesn't give a flying bleep as to, what side of the aisle your politics is on. And a couple of though people that were trying to justify President Trump's comments were sending me screenshots about the DEI provisions that were on the FAA website. Yeah, it's a US government website. Yes, most of the US government have had pages that are dedicated to their diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, much like you'll find on any government website anywhere globally, in fact, not just in the US. But let us be very clear. In reality, DEI provisions do not apply to air traffic control recruitment, have not applied to air traffic control recruitment in the US. The process is purely focused on competency and safety.
Yep. Well said. I think we need to give some kudos to American Airlines CEO. He has seemed to handle this as professionally and well as you can, right?
Yeah. His response was literally the textbook response in terms of what airline CEOs are provided with crisis training, and how they have to react initially kind of in a statement, then appear in a video, and also continue to prioritize the loved ones, continue to prioritize the family members, don't get drawn into anything else. I've studied those textbooks pretty closely in terms of crisis communications for an airline. It was textbook. The statement from American Airlines, from himself, then the video statement, then his actions after, his press conference, the emphasis on working with authorities to understand what went wrong, but to make sure that the family members, the loved ones, he mentioned the friends as well, were at the heart of all of this, not forgetting that we are talking about human lives. The other conversations he didn't pay any attention to. I just think it was a real sensible textbook response from the American Airlines CEO, from Robert.
Also, for context, for anyone who is concerned or afraid because of the string of recent incidents we've seen in the past 5 weeks, just a reminder that there are tens of thousands of flights every single day and nothing happens. People are safe. So, your odds are low of something if you're 1 in 100. So if you're 1 in tens of thousands, really, you never have to worry. I'm not worried to step on board a plane. Alex isn't, well, on most airlines, and you don't need to be either.
Look, it continues to be the safest form of transport. There's work to be done in places like the US, that's for sure. It's very well documented as to what has gone wrong systematically there. And, the hope, of course, is that you learn, and that the US will learn from something as awful as what has happened. And I guess then we'll end this discussion on what happened by saying once again that our thoughts go out to loved ones and friends and family who, they shouldn't have had to have been going through all this in 2025 with the way in which air travel continues to be so safe. It's just so grossly unfair, and our thoughts are with all of the loved ones there.
Yes, they are. So with that, let's go and answer some of your guys' questions in Q&A. So let's start with something simple here. A question from Mark. He says, he only found the podcast a few weeks ago and he's caught up to June 24th. Nicely done. So he types this sitting in the Cathay Pacific first class lounge at Heathrow, waiting for his flight on the little airline that could. Finnair on their beautiful A350. Isn't Air Baltic the little airline that could, though?
Finnair is not the little airline that could. Finnair is the little airline that does.
Air
Baltic is the little airline that could.
We appreciate these references, though, Mark. His question is, he wants to travel with Qatar and Emirates to try their first-class products. He says, would we recommend starting our experience in London and Dubai? No, in Doha and Dubai rather than in London, as the food and ground experience will be better. What do you think?
The fastest yes ever. Next question.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. Although, I don't know, like the Qatar Lounge at Heathrow, does that have a first class section? I haven't been.
It doesn't have a dedicated first class section in the QR Lounge at Terminal 4 at Heathrow. But the reason why it's the fastest yes, despite both airlines having beautiful lounges in London, is because it's always better to fly, to experience the airline from its hub, right? That doesn't just apply to these two airlines, it applies almost universally. So yeah, if you have that choice, I think you should do it from the Middle East if it's a choice.
Yes.
I have a question here from Jack. He says, "Hi Alex, I hope you're doing well and I love the podcast. I was recently reading an interesting article about Qantas Engineering and why they're struggling to keep their planes in the air." Goodness, send me the article. He says, but a little tidbit caught my attention at the bottom. The article mentions that Vanessa Hudson, the CEO, is looking at getting another 6 Finnair A330s, as well as to add to the fleet on wet lease. It would make a lot of sense from Qantas's point of view, but I'm just wondering if it would actually make sense for Finnair to wet lease out their other A330s. Well, this is a great question, Jack. Whether or not it would make sense for Finnair to give over 6, I can't imagine. I mean, they are, adjusting to life without Russian airspace. I don't think they are struggling to the extent that they need to, rid themselves of 6 wide bodies. But what I will set the scene with is that airlines everywhere are absolutely struggling to get hold of any additional aircraft, mostly because of the troubles at Boeing and also because of the supply chain issues that affect Airbus. So both manufacturers are struggling to deliver. I've never seen a struggle in the aviation world to get hands on any aircraft, never mind a new aircraft, as I have now in these times. Airlines are fighting for these old raggedy second, third, fourth, fifth hand aircraft at the highest leasing prices I have ever seen because there is such an aircraft shortage globally. So, would it make sense for Qantas to try to get a few more from Finnair? Of course, it would make sense for anyone right now. Tim Clark of Emirates just sat down and did an interview with Sky News Australia yesterday, and it was saying, "Oh, we can't get our hands on aircraft, and there's a shortage," and and Sky News Australia tried to make it all political, Dan, and they were like, "Oh, do you have a message for Trump then about Boeing and how that?"
Sky News Australia is crazy.
Yeah, some of their interviews are, Anyway, that's not for the podcast.
Yeah,
I'll give you a call later. We can discuss. But everyone is in that boat, whether you're a small player, even if you don't exist. Look at little Riyadh Air on a PowerPoint airline. They are having to delay the launch of what is going to be the big Saudi hotshot carrier because there are no planes. So if Qantas can get some from Finnair, then of course that would make commercial sense for them, and it would help Finnair out adjust to this ongoing life without Russian overflight. But I think 6 is a lot. I mean, let's see. Sticking with my questions, Dan, I want to ask you this one that Jonah has asked me. So I want to pass it over to you. So Jonah says, "Hi, Alex. Question for the podcast. I'm flying my first flight with Emirates business class. It's my first time ever in business class," he says, "this spring from Milan to JFK. What advice do we have on how to maximize the time on board?" He says there's so much to do and enjoy, but I'm not sure that 8.5 hours is enough to have the full experience. How would you both schedule your time? So 8.5 hours, Milan to JFK. Dan, over to you.
All right. Well, as a Emirates frequent flyer, I will say one thing to be aware of is that their meal services take a long time. So I would count on 3 hours probably for lunch after takeoff, which means even less time to do other stuff. But that's why during the meal, plan on it taking a while. So that's your time to watch a movie or recline your seat and get comfortable. They hand out mattress pads straight after takeoff so you can get nice and comfy. Then head to the bar, chat a bit between lunch and the pre-landing meal, maybe take a bit of a nap. And if you want, skip the pre-landing meal to enjoy the bed or whatever it is, because most pre-landing meals on transatlantic flights aren't the most exciting. I personally haven't flown Emirates from Milan to JFK, but that is approximately how I do it. Do you think it sounds good, Alex?
I think that sounds good. I think that we're aligned there, and I think you can also get a fairly decent idea as to how to spend the time if you watch that YouTube video that you put up of you and I on the Qatar first class flight. Yeah. Right? That was quite similar to what you described. Kind of took off, we were chatting, we were eating, we were watching, and then when that was all done, we went to the bar for a bit, and then after the bar, we came back and the beds were made up. So basically, you just described without me realizing, I realized that I just followed your routine, or maybe that is the sensible routine we both already have.
I think it's the sensible routine. I have a question here from Meg. She says, "I've been a listener since day one, and honestly, it brightens up my Thursday morning commute. So thank you both." So sweet. My partner and I often wonder when we're walking through business, not sitting, crying emoji, what happens to all the leftover amenity kits that people do not take with them? Are they thrown away or are they reused? This has a sad answer, doesn't it?
Well, airlines need to get better at this. But for many airlines, if the amenity kit if the seal has been broken, right, or it's been, opened in any way, as awful as it sounds, they are not reused, even if they're fine. And so typically they end up in some kind of trash, which is not good at all. Some airlines have far better practices, conscious of sustainability, in terms of having it fully, if it's fully intact, if it was just the seal was open but everything is fine, then it's able to kind of go back into distribution again. Some others find a second life somewhere, maybe as part of a charity sale at the airline's home hub internally with staff and things like that. I've seen that at a few airline hubs, but the quick answer is that they can be incredibly wasteful. And so please take it, even if, and I always think about this, even if you are super frequent flyers, like for example you and I, okay, we take them because I would rather than it going in the trash, take it, give it to somebody. It's such a great little, here's what I got you from the flight, cousin or, driver or neighbor or whatever. They're unique little things. No one's saying, I'm not talking about the whole idea of regifting. Don't wrap it up and say, hey, I got you this expensive bag from the white company filled with products, and then they're going to open it and they're going to see a big fat with compliments from British Airways logo in the middle of it. Don't do that, but be smart about it.
And also, homeless shelters want amenity kits, so bring them. Yeah. Even if you're leaving a flight, you see other people have left them, you can bring theirs, because things like socks or eye masks or toothbrush and toothpaste, they really want that stuff. So it's super valuable. And if I ran an airline, I would personally do it Singapore Airlines style. Every amenity you can imagine is available on request. You can get a kit if you want, but having it as a standard, I agree, is very wasteful. It makes it feel more luxurious and fun, but at the end of the day, Meg is right that you walk through business and 80 or 90% of the kits are left at the seat, opened, which just feels like such a sad waste when maybe someone, like, usually I just want a pair of earplugs in the amenity kit. So if someone's opening that up, taking out a pair of earplugs, leaving the rest, that's just a shame. When, in another scenario, they could request a pair of earplugs from the crew and we save a whole lot of resources along the way.
Definitely. Good advice, good tips. Well, look, I'm glad that we had this extensive episode to kind of reflect on what had happened and give it some thought, some explainers, and some discussion. And Q&A is always fun. Feel free to send in your questions, dear listeners, via the usual channels. And I guess with that, we'll wrap. And I'll say that we'll see you same time, same place next week.
We will, in vision, hopefully, fingers crossed. So,
Fingers crossed.
We will see you then on air. Bye-bye.